came out of COVID, you had a very inactive Chinese American community here in terms of politics. And so many of them have become so outspoken against the Communist Party, participating in protests, getting active in writing and informing people that whole racist tag is dissolving, because you have, people say, look, I lived in that system, or some saying I was part of that system. This is really how it works. And now you have even some attacks of people who are more sympathetic toward the CCP trying to say, oh no, the Chinese American population here, now it's becoming right wing. They're not very credible. And there's an attempt to marginalize Chinese Americans as an emerging political force.
Yeah, there was a Vice News little piece that they, like a video that they did about Chinese Trump supporters. Mm-hmm. And it was actually, for Vice, mostly fairly non-judgmental. But the person that they had interviewed the most was this Chinese dissident who had been a journalist in China, and she had been locked up in China for her journalism. She came to the U.S. As an asylum seeker and went to a Trump rally. Mm-hmm. And then they interviewed her, and she was talking about how, in China, the government is covering up the truth in the news, and now Americans are learning that this is the case, et cetera. And then they tied her to Q, essentially, by saying that, then she came across, I don't know what else she talked to them about in the course of their entire interview, but halfway through the Vice News piece, suddenly Q comes up, and then it has her talking about how she watches a video on Q, and she totally could believe that there's this conspiracy, and she believes that there's a swamp in Washington, D.C., something like that. So it was not outright condemning her, but it kind of portrayed her as just kind of naive, or maybe traumatized by her experiences in China. So then she fell for Q in the U.S.
Yeah, the media's take on a lot of not just Chinese Americans, but Chinese activists who are in the U.S. now, just they couldn't handle the idea that these people are minorities, but they are also saying Trump is doing good on China. That was just a short circuit that they couldn't get around.
I recommend this piece by Perry Link in the New York Review of Books, where he just very kind of calmly and rationally talks about why some prominent, very intelligent Chinese dissidents and intellectuals supported Trump, and that not all of them did. Many of them were against him, but that there was the split in the Chinese dissident community, and it had nothing to do with believing in things like Q. It was about the fact that, it was essentially about the absolute failure of U.S. policy toward China for decades, and the fact that the U.S. government never listened to these Chinese dissidents who were trying to tell them what the CCP was.
Yeah, I mean, here Trump was really the only president who was ever tough on the Chinese Communist Party since 1949, right? But really tough on them. You can understand how any Chinese American, especially immigrants who can vote, who might be socially liberal, and I know some who had supported Hillary Clinton in the 2020 election, but they loved what Trump was saying about the CCP, and they gravitated to that. But I think any politician who would be tough on the CCP could get that same voter base if they're a one-issue voter who really cares about going after the party back in the old homeland. But so you had this. Now you have a demonization of a lot of Chinese Americans who are speaking out against the CCP because they might have supported Trump or because they're sounding like Trump. And this, again, will go into to benefit the party's propaganda machine, whether or not it's doing it on its own. And one presumes it is. And if you see certain things in the Global Times and elsewhere and on Twitter from CCP outlets, you can see how they're taking advantage of it, that to use this race card now, that if you're against CCP, you hate Chinese people, and if you're a Chinese American, you're really a banana who's white on the inside, and you're not a real Chinese person.
And one thing I want to add, Shelley was mentioning how everything the FBI is doing about these academics who have mysterious ties to the Chinese Communist Party, how that's been called racist. I'm just also reminded of the Hunter Biden story and how that was just killed in the media ahead of the election. in 2020. And that's I think that's another great example of how discourse on the Chinese Communist Party is being held up.
Yeah.
It really is. And then if you have news organizations that say Bloomberg, where the owner has so many investments tied to the CCP, and he exercises editorial supervision pretty well over his ostensibly non-biased news entity. So if Bloomberg's doing that, other news outlets are doing that, certain TV outlets are doing that, and then the talking heads that they use as experts on the subject, who they come from Brookings Institute. How much money does Brookings take from the Chinese Communist Party companies and their related interests and their American partners? You've got the John Thornton Center there that's tied in with Tsinghua University, and that's their center of China studies at the most influential think tank in Washington. So it's dependent on the Chinese Communist Party for much of its funding, and then so many American universities are. Look at what Princeton was getting from Chinese Communist Party funded entities at the Biden Center there. But it's almost like name the university that has a China Studies program or an international relations program. Georgetown University, right here in Washington D.C. They're going to be extremely careful of offending the Chinese Communist Party. So that means their professors are in the classroom, and the books they write, in the articles they write, in the media appearances that they make, and then in the public positions they take when they're called out of academia to serve in a presidential administration.
Yes, this is what makes it so hard to identify influence operations, because it's not like the Communist Party is, installing its trained agents as U.S. professors or installing its trained agents as CEOs of American companies or whatever. You have, regular Americans who, for whether it's for their careers or for money or for, political reasons, are, to some degree siding with the Communist Party narrative and pushing that, but it's really for their own benefit. And the Communist Party is able to take advantage of that to push their agenda. Like, it's not like it's a very subtle thing, and it takes advantage of this kind of free speech. Because if you're a professor in the U.S., like, you can say what you want. It's okay to say, you have this view or you have a completely different view, right? That's kind of how academics is supposed to work theoretically. So it's like no one can say for sure why your view on China is so pro-Communist Party. Like, you're allowed to have that view. But from the Communist Party's perspective, they've worked for a long time to gradually and subtly influence that view.
Right. And they did it by a very positive strategic campaign of seduction, of appealing to cooperation and understanding. And it's all very positive. China's peaceful rise, and China's very different, and you Westerners don't understand. Let us show you. And by the way, would you like to be part of this academic program? And how can we support your own studies program? And maybe offer some scholarships for some of your students to come and study in China for a year. And let's just build relations like this and see, what good can come out of it. And over the years, these are really great relationships, but you're not going to say something to jeopardize those relationships. To the contrary. And it's not all necessarily pro-CCP in saying that the party is good or Xi Jinping is good. That would be sort of a party line. And you do have some people giving that party line, especially at the Thornton Center at Brookings and elsewhere, where it's a 100% party line. But the real pernicious propaganda is that which is subtle. It's, you have to understand, Xi Jinping doesn't feel secure. And so if he's to help China advance with its huge population and its big social problems, he has to get tough with people. And remember, the Chinese people are different from us. So we just have to be understanding of this.
Yeah, I mean, you got to understand that sometimes you need to lock up 1 million ethnic minorities.
Yeah. I mean,
that's just their way of doing things.
Yeah.
That does make it harder to make that argument, I feel. Like, the Uyghur situation, I think, has made it harder for people to say some of these things about China.
And the Chinese government really worked that well. They bought off Pakistan quickly, so the Pakistanis aren't complaining about the Uyghurs. They bought off the Saudis as big oil customers. They're trying to replace the United States as the guarantor of Saudi security and maybe even replace the petrodollar. And so the Saudis have an interest in not saying anything about it. Qatar has an interest in not saying anything about it. So much CCP money is tied up in Dubai, and the Emiratis aren't going to say anything about it. So you have the most influential Muslim-dominated countries in the world all being quiet about this stuff. So if they're not upset about it, why should the rest of the world be upset about it?
It is interesting that on the list of people coming to the Olympics are also prominent leaders from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, like just large parts of the Middle East. Pakistan, obviously, prime minister is going. So yeah, the list that the CCP released of the people who are the dignitaries who are coming to the Olympics is quite telling.
Yeah, and not a peep of what I think the Czech Republic said they weren't sending some people, and there's sort of a lame diplomatic boycott from other countries, but it's sort of a too little too late type of thing. One has to wonder, like in the case of Qatar, where you have the FIFA games this year in soccer, where there was a huge amount of corruption in getting FIFA to approve Qatar as the host for the games this year. Imagine the corruption within the International Olympic Committees on making the 2022 games again in China.